the Euro panel: هل تتهاوى أوروبا أم هل ستتغلب على العواصف؟ يشارك في استضافة الحلقة الصحفية والرؤية والتي يديرها السيد نيك جوينغ. أدعو دكتور دانيال تورك الرئيس السابق لسلوفينيا، السيد أليستر بيرت وزير الدولة السابق للشرق الأوسط في وزارة الخارجية وشؤون الكومنولث المملكة المتحدة، السيد فيليب جوردن منسق البيت الأبيض السابق للشرق الأوسط، سير جون سكارلت الرئيس السابق لجهاز المخابرات السرية البريطانية، وسيد ميشيل دوكلوس الدبلوماسي الفرنسي وزميل أقدم في معهد مونتان.
Welcome. I'm going to stand down here to make this feel a little more intimate. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes about the relationship between Europe and the Middle East. But that really means we've got to start off with what's the state of Europe today. And if you think everyone has a clear idea, then you are wrong. We will shed light on it through different ways, both from the US perspective, the Slovenian perspective, the French perspective, the British perspective twice. But much is changing in ways which you probably are monitoring in a relatively detailed way. But for those of us like myself and Alistair Burt and John Scarlett who live in the United Kingdom, trying to work out what's happening hour by hour, minute by minute, is incredibly difficult. That makes us, gives us a challenge today, which is how do we portray to you the state of the European Union, the state of Europe, however you want to define it, including NATO, including also nations which are not in NATO, not in the European Union, at a time when so much is changing, including the European Commission. The European Parliament has new fractures within it, and yesterday we had the Polish election, the general election, which has reaffirmed and reasserted a greater strength for the Law and Justice Party. They now have a majority in the lower house in Warsaw, the Sejm. So much is changing. What we might have said a week or two ago is probably different to what we're going to say today, and probably what we might have said, might be saying in 3 or 4 days from now. My proposal is this, and I've discussed it with all the panelists, is that we talk about Europe to begin with, the state of Europe, and then we morph into the Middle East. So in the 45 minutes we've got, we will be on the Middle East. But we do have a crisis in Europe at the moment, however you want to define it. And I should say, I do apologize at the moment, you're faced with 6 men in dark jackets, which is very different, ragged, to what else you've achieved here with diversity, both of generation and gender.
If I had a cancellation by a woman, the last minute, it is beyond my ability to restructure that at the last moment. But I did take care, very good care, of the gender balance to the extent possible.
That's why I'm saying this is
unfortunately, I had some cancellations, but here I am. I'll make it up.
We're on the same wavelength. I just wanted to say we're conscious that there isn't the gender and age balance that we've tried to create in the last few hours and last night as well. So what we're going to do is talk about Europe to begin with. I do have a microphone. I'm conscious there hasn't been any interchange, and I'd like you to feel that even in 44 minutes, 43 minutes, if you have something you want to say, then I have a microphone, because it could be you've got great questions which we're not answering. And so I have a microphone, and there are a couple of microphones around as well. So see it in advance of the town hall as something which is more interactive. That's what I've said to all of the panelists. So Alistair Burt, let's come to you first. I should just introduce you. You've been in Parliament for 32 years, representing a constituency north of London, which is largely a rural constituency, from the Conservative Party, and he's announced he's leaving Parliament. He's no longer a Foreign Office Minister, which he was for 5 years until a few weeks ago, and is representative of some of the real tensions within not just the British Conservative Party, but also within the British political class, and dare I say, the British political system of governance, which all of you are meant to respect. We're not sure who respects what these days in Parliament. Alistair, can I ask you first of all to highlight what you've been through, what Parliament is going through, and where we might be going, and you've only got about 3 minutes to do that in, 4 minutes, because we need to move on quickly and get other perspectives.
Thank you, Nick, and Rahida, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be amongst all my friends and be back here again, and thank you for the opportunity. Let me outline just briefly the national situation, then say a little bit about how it reflects personally. The whole of the referendum process has dominated the last 3 years of British politics. The decision taken in 2015 to have a referendum to confirm or reject the United Kingdom's membership of the European Union turned into a referendum in 2016, but a binary referendum, leave or stay in, but no blueprint for how to leave if a decision was taken to leave the EU. That has then dominated our domestic politics to an extraordinary extent. People now talk, the pollsters will tell you that people have lost their traditional allegiances to political parties and define themselves as leavers or remainers. The discourse in the United Kingdom has changed radically in terms of the hostility of language of one towards the other in Parliament and outside Parliament. Parliament has not been able, with the government, to come to a conclusion as to in what way we leave the European Union. The last Prime Minister was felled in the early part of this year because she could not get a negotiated agreement with the EU through the British Parliament. That process has now been taken over by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and we are in potentially the last 2 or 3 weeks. The Prime Minister has set a deadline himself that the United Kingdom will leave on October the 31st with or without a deal. This has been opposed by members of Parliament, a number of whom, like me, voted to remain in the European Union, but accepted that the referendum result should be honoured, but are very determined that the United Kingdom should not leave without a deal because of the potential catastrophic impact of that. We have therefore banded together to give the Prime Minister a demand that if he cannot secure a deal by October the 31st, he must, by our command, ask for an extension from the European Union. The Prime Minister plainly does not wish to do this. He wants to obey the law, but it is plainly not his policy. So you have this dynamic between Parliament and the government and potentially the people, which has led to a toxic, very difficult mix. Decisions have to be taken in the next few days. Parliament will sit next Saturday either to agree the deal that the Prime Minister is trying to secure this week or to take another course of action. For me personally, which was Nick's point, I reached the point after 32 years of being a Conservative Member of Parliament, of being faced with a vote, and I was told by the party that if I voted to prevent a no-deal solution, to require the Prime Minister to seek an extension, I would be stripped of the party whip, which meant I could not stand in the next general election as a Conservative. I decided I had to do this because it was the old story of country before party. I thought the right decision was not to allow a no-deal conclusion to be the end result, and thus I lost my party designation in Parliament. And I took the opportunity to say enough, and I would leave. So the consequence for me and a number of other colleagues has been very dramatic, very drastic. I've been a member of the Conservative Party for 50 years next year, and so it rather hurts to be told, particularly by a government which is only there because it rebelled against Prime Minister Theresa May, that it's I'm the one who should leave the party, not them. But that's politics.
So we're very fortunate that Alistair's here because he can highlight the kind of real tensions, the Rift Valley, the seismic impact, not just in the United Kingdom, but also across much of what the European Union stands for. And indeed, there are implications for NATO and other organizations as well. So let me keep building the bricks. Very quickly, Alistair, before I ask others to join in, where do you think this is leaving British governance and the credibility of the British political system? Because we have always been a significant power within Europe, you as a minister know that, which has been respected for the way we've stood our ground. But now we are the United Kingdom is withdrawing, but there are those in the European Union who are deeply concerned that actually the absence of Britain is going to weaken the European Union.
A couple of things, if I may, very briefly. I was Foreign Office Minister before the referendum decision and after. I found around the world a surprise that the UK had decided to leave the EU, but I respect that was a sovereign decision by the British people. But complete mystification at the way in which the decision has been handled and the failure to get a resolution by now. I think it has damaged the United Kingdom's Parliament and government's perception in the world about how it handles affairs, and I think we have taken a diplomatic hit. If we can get this resolved, then perhaps things can be restored, but there's no doubt that we've taken some damage because of the way in which it's been handled. Whether or not the UK and the EU will be weakened depends on your stance, but let me put it briefly. I think both the EU and the UK are weakened in significant respects. Trading situation is weakened for the United Kingdom because we're leaving the world's largest single market. The diplomatic reach of the United Kingdom is going to be less because we're no longer part of a European-wide diplomatic process. We have issues in relation to defence and security. We won't be at the same table at the same time. And for all those issues, then I think the United Kingdom will suffer. I think Europe will be weakened because a large economy is coming out of the EU, and also it highlights the risks and the dangers to the EU. The EU is now mature. It's not as it was at the beginning. It faces a number of challenges. For the United Kingdom to have left poses questions. Whether or not negotiations about Britain staying in before David Cameron lost the referendum could have been handled differently is a wider question. Europe, if it's wise, will look at the reasons for the United Kingdom leaving, realise they weren't singular to the United Kingdom. The question of what states do altogether, what they should do individually to have a sense of sovereignty and independence is at the heart of the European debate internally going forward. But if the right lessons are learned, maybe both can, in a way, get over this. But one of the reasons I'm leaving is that having spent my life as a politician in the European Union, believing in it, I would rather the United Kingdom was there to work with others, but there'll be a new partnership created, and I hope it will be strong for both, but it will take time.
Thanks, Alistair. You're talking, therefore, about a very different complexion of the Europe you've taken for granted, and it's sobering that David Cameron, in his memoirs published about a month ago, said he made a mistake. He didn't understand exactly what was happening in the United Kingdom, even he as Prime Minister. And he talked about a new framing for politics as well, which only now he can say, now he's 3 years out of office. Now, Alistair mentioned security. John Scarlett, until 6 years ago, you were head of MI6 and you've Joint Intelligence Committee. One of the things which is very clear is the problems now of security through Europol and the security and intelligence cooperation, which has been at the heart, not much spoken about. And I was reflecting with you, I heard Bernard Cazeneuve, a former French Prime Minister, talk about the absolute importance of British intelligence when it came to tracking down a number of terrorists, particularly after the Charlie Hebdo massacre. What is your reflection on the relationship now between and the strength of intelligence and therefore security, which is going to affect this region?
Well, thank you, Nick. And first of all, may I say, since I'm on this panel now, after other appearances here, a thank you to Regida Dergam as well for her hospitality here, an extraordinary organization. It's quite scary, I have to say. Congratulations and thank you. Right, well, I was listening carefully to what Alistair said. Maybe I can just say how much I respect his views, his career, and the position he has taken. I very strongly feel that. The particular issue of security, because there are many, many aspects to the negotiations for the relationship with the European Union, but UK-European Union. It's an immensely complicated subject. When the referendum result happened, unexpectedly, really, in 2016, I can honestly say my first thought was that it is vastly more complicated than anybody seems to understand, and we're bound to have real difficulties sorting it out within the political structure and within Parliament, and I think any country would find it very, very difficult. This was greatly underestimated in the campaign. Now, one of the features of the negotiating process has, of course, been around national security issues. That's been an important part of the negotiations which have been going on between London and Brussels under the May government until very recently. And indeed, the 26-page political declaration, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, has very carefully worded paragraphs which form the basis and create the basis for subsequent post-withdrawal negotiations, which will put in place a good, more or less reasonable structure for replacing the one we have at the moment. But as it stands, and certainly when everybody talks about a no-deal Brexit, there's been very little public attention and debate devoted, as you said, to the national security aspect of our departure. And I mean, this is quite a complicated subject, and there's been a lot of misunderstanding about it. But essentially, in national security is a national sovereign issue under the Treaty of Lisbon, 2007. Article 4.2a, I think, was the one that was there. I may have got that number slightly wrong, which says that it's very unusual in an EU treaty for something to be marked out as a national sovereignty issue, and that was at the insistence, really, of the United Kingdom. I was involved in that at the time. It's 10 years, by the way, since I left the service, not 6. And the country that supported us in that issue was France, because we're the two countries who have intelligence. So, of course, we think carefully about who we share it with, automatically. And yeah, I'll keep going. Now, so obviously a very important part of national security is sharing between countries on a bilateral basis, because it's a national sovereign issue. But increasingly, over the last 5-6 years, a big part of our national security management, and particularly our counter-terrorism management, has been built up around data management databases. And there are a series of databases which now exist in the national security area, particularly the Schengen Information System 2, the European Arrest Warrant System, I could go on, database management, DNA management and so on, which allow intelligence to be passed very, very quickly under a common data regime, management regime, which of course is vital when you're watching people who are crossing frontiers and so on passenger flights or whatever it might be. And that will stop. If we leave without a deal, that will stop overnight. And that data will not come through to the United Kingdom under data adequacy rules, and also in our own contribution to European security issues and movements and counter-terrorism issues and so on will stop automatically too. Now, obviously, as an intelligence and security player, and as has been mentioned by Bernard Cazeneuve, for example, the United Kingdom is a very important player. I mean, as a single individual country, probably, I say immodestly, the most important player in that particular area within the Union. And so, of course, this will impact negatively on the European Union, but it'll also impact very negatively on the United Kingdom and our well-being and our safety. And there is no easy answer to it if we're not part of a treaty structure, because you get into fundamental issues of data sharing and so on. That's it.
So what you've got is a very clear impression of how, if you like, the stability we've all taken for granted is now beginning to unravel, and will unravel literally like a guillotine at 2300 hours UK time on the 31st of October. Let's broaden the perspectives to the assessments here. Can I go to Michel, who is from Paris, and your president has been very firm about saying we've got to save the European Union. We've got to save the integrity of the European Union. It's under massive pressure, particularly the forces which are beginning to pull it apart in many ways. When you listen to John and Alistair, what's your assessment from Paris about the nature of the European Union, which the Middle East will have to be dealing with?
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much to Harida and the Burt Institute for inviting me. Maybe I should tell you where I'm speaking from. I've been following closely Syria since a long time. And it seems to me that the developments in Syria amount to a defeat of the Western world. Until recently, we could think that we were facing a series of lost battles. Now, since a few days, we have lost the war. It doesn't mean that it is the end of the world, actually. Great countries have been able to survive to a lot of lost wars. We, France, we have lost many wars in front of Britain, and we are still there. But it's an important turning point for the West, it seems to me. And among the conclusions that should be drawn by the Europeans is the need to invest in defense and security. And that's a point I know Macron is very keen about. And it's that we should stop looking inward and shift to looking outward. And if we look outward, we see that we have a lot of threats, or at least challenges, that we can face only in common with other European countries, such as China, the rising power of China, cyber security, the need to find a new way to work with the US and also with Russia, and of course, the big troubles in the Middle East. Climate change, other things like that. So now the job of the European Union is much more about geopolitics than about internal matters.
All at the same time as we're getting a new commission, we've got a new European Parliament. The dynamics of politics in the European Union at the highest levels are now uncertain for the next 2 or 3 months at least.
Yes, I think the next 3, 4, 5 years will be certainly crucial for the fate of Europe. It seems to me that the result of the last European elections were not that bad, and that with the new Commission, whatever are the last difficulties, with the new Commission we have a good chance to tackle the real issues. I must say that, of course, in France, responsible people feel very, very sorry about the Brexit. And it's true that from a European point of view, given precisely the challenges and threats in the world, it's the worst moment for Britain to leave the Union.
Mais c'est comme ça, maintenant.
Mais c'est comme ça.
On doit accepter, oui.
We have to accept it.
Oui.
Yes.
We're doing this project about thinking the unthinkable, and certainly it felt unthinkable, but actually it's rather unpalatable. Danilo, I'm going to come to you in a moment, because what I want to do is get the view from Washington. You, Phil, we first knew each other a rather long time ago at the IISS in London when you were a fellow there, but you've since had several posts within the White House and the State Department, and now you're at the Council on Foreign Relations, and so you're not in the engine room of the White House. But what is your assessment of when you've heard these three contributions? And Danilo, I'm going to ask to bring all this together about how powerful Europe is or how weakened Europe is. What's your assessment from Washington?
Sure. Thanks, Nick, and thanks to
Just move the microphone a little closer, can you?
For including me on this panel to give an American perspective. And I, as the American on the panel, I guess I'm conscious of the expression about glass houses and throwing stones as we begin impeachment hearings and go through our own sort of chaos in our
We can talk about that if you want.
Well, no, my point is simply that I am
We can distract from Europe's problem very
conscious
easily.
of that as I sit up here with my European colleagues and question Europe's stability. And yet, if the question is, how much are these things that we're discussing going to interfere with Europe as a partner of the United States, I'm afraid I have to say, from an American perspective, they will. Indeed, the very fact that we appropriately took the first whatever % of this panel to talk about these complicated Brexit issues and the degree to which London will be preoccupied sort of underscores the point.
But it is extended into Poland, into Hungary, into Italy, and many
and
other nations.
of course, it's not
as well.
just Brexit. Brexit is a main thing, and it's taking what arguably was our key partner in Europe to a degree out of the debate, which is ironic because Prime Minister Cameron said he launched the referendum in part to stop banging on about Europe. And as far as I can tell, our British friends have been doing almost nothing else since the referendum. And then you add on top of that other weak governments, populism, refugee crisis, continued Eurozone crisis, terrorism. There are a lot of reasons why Europe is going to be preoccupied as it pivots to, and Michel said, I think, the next 5 years, right? You'll be focused on these issues, new commission and government. So, why does an American care? Traditionally, we have seen Europe as our key partner in world affairs. Unless you take the view that the United States can manage the entire world by itself and it doesn't need partners, and that would be a tough view to take these days, you look around the world and traditionally we have expected Europeans to be that main partner, making important contributions on security, economy, development, and diplomacy. And it's just a simple reality that if Europe is going to be massively preoccupied with these internal challenges, it's just not going to be that partner. And I know as we go on, you'll want to talk about Europe and the Middle East, and I think this will be relevant for that issue. It was hard enough to partner with Europe in the Middle East and around the world when Europe was in better shape politically, economically, and so on. But if it's going to be just tearing itself up internally, then I think from an American perspective, you do have to wonder about the state of that other pillar in this transatlantic relationship.
Macron did say last year he was fearful of sleepwalking into a kind of pulling apart of the European Union. And Franz Timmermans, the former, well, he's vice president again now, but he said 3 years ago, Europe was on the brink over the migration crisis. And I'm going to come to Danilo in a moment, but on the brink, in other words, Europe not being able to hold together. And Soros has said he could see the European Union actually disintegrating like the Soviet Union. Is that the kind of assessment you're making in Washington?
I think it's possible. What is certainly true is that this decades-long process of increasing integration seems to be over. For many decades, the question was, what will be Europe's next big project? And it was slow and it was halting and sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 back. But the general trend was towards more political integration, economic integration, and enlargement. That seems to be over. There's not even a big project anymore. The project is more salvaging what there is. And yes, I think it's fair to wonder not only, and frankly, this is probably the first time in my professional career where it would actually be legitimate to ask that question, will the European Union survive and be in place in X number of years, in 3 to 5 years. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I don't think that question would have been a relevant one. It's fair to ask now. One is, slight bit of optimism. I think 2 years ago it looked even worse. When the refugee crisis was at its peak and the Eurozone crisis was worse than it is now, and the spate of terrorist attacks across Europe led to even more feelings of crisis and populism. Things have stabilized somewhat. But still, I think it is fair to ask the question about the stability of the European Union going forward. Last point I would say on this, because you ask about American perspectives, you also have to take into account the way the administration sees Europe. Because I gave you a general answer about how analysts or I see Europe, but I think there's something new there too from this administration. If I was right in describing the traditional American view of wanting a strong European partner to work with us globally on pursuing our common interests and values, I'm not so convinced anymore that that's the case, that is the way this president and the administration sees Europe. The president himself has defined Europe as a foe. He regularly argues that they are, quote unquote, worse than China on things like trade. The administration has hardly gone out of its way to align its view with Europeans on questions like climate change. The president has questioned NATO's core pillar of Article 5 and common defense. On diplomatic cooperation like the Iran nuclear deal, we not only pulled out, but even though Europe bent over backwards to try to find a way to keep us in the deal, we basically said, thanks but no thanks. And the administration has articulated a worldview that is based on America first and national sovereignty, and frankly, and I'll finish with this, arguably hostility towards that European project that was traditionally supported by presidents of both parties. And I think whereas some of us would regret the divisions in the European Union and the reality of what I said, that it's possible to question its future, I think there are some in this administration, including the president himself, who would welcome that. Because if Europe's divided, it no longer can consolidate and quote-unquote gang up against us on trade, and it is easier to divide and conquer when Europeans are divided themselves.
So we hope you are not choking on your lunch and you're being cheered up. Danilo, can you cheer us up in any way? And I have to reflect, you were president of Slovenia, you were at the United Nations for 3 decades, but I still remember a platform in Bled, a glorious place next to Ljubljana, on the lake, the rowing lake, during the migration crisis, where the likes of Donald Tusk, President Kolinda of Croatia, and others did not want to believe that the migration crisis would be a crisis. They thought it would somehow solve itself. And look at the impact on Germany and Hungary and many other nations. What's your reflection? And take us in as well to the Middle East.
Well, first of all, let me join the chorus of those who have spoken highly about these meetings that we are having and express gratitude to Ragida for bringing us all together.
Shall we all applaud Ragida now?
Well, that's the way to start cheering up. Now, secondly, and more to the point of our discussion this afternoon, we have heard practically all major reasons for concern. And of course, these are very real reasons for concern. But then I think one has to look at the problem of European Union from a longer-term perspective. In Europe, there was never a shortage of grand visions for the future. Now, when those grand visions were put into practice, many of them ended very badly. If they were ideological, like the Holy Roman Empire, or political, like the Napoleonic system, or Hitler's vision, which was also a vision of unified Europe. Now, all that failed, and sometimes failed with huge, tragic, dramatic consequences. But then European Union was the beginning of a construction which was pragmatic, which was step by step, and which has built a solid structure. And this is the solid structure that we now have. Obviously, Brexit is a big shock for the European Union. We are talking about Brexit as something very likely. I would not say inevitable, but very likely. And it will certainly, if it happens, weaken not only the United Kingdom, it will weaken the European Union very significantly. And we have heard a lot about the weakening that is likely to happen. Now, I guess that you expect from me some precise definitions of what could be a way forward. What could be a way forward for European Union in this kind of circumstances?
What is needed to reinstate confidence in Europe?
Yeah, well, look, question. I mean, I'm not going into the psychological aspects, but I would like to stay in the realm of history and politics. First, I think European Union can draw strength from the fact that it has been built gradually and that it has created fairly solid structure within itself. And today in the continent you would not find a serious politician who would argue in favor of leaving European Union. Salvini tried that, but then the Italians changed government. And in East Europe, of course, there is a great deal of skepticism, there is a great deal of talk, but one has to be very careful there because East Europe has generally suffered from something that can be described a syndrome of victimhood. East European politicians like to talk about their countries and their peoples as victims, including victims of Brussels. But that does not mean that they are coming closer to the idea of leaving European Union. Now, I may be biased. You see, I'm coming from Slovenia, a country where you would not find a single politician who would ever dare to say anything about leaving European Union. So please keep that bias in mind, and maybe that bias is the basis for my fairly optimistic talk. Now, what I'm trying to say is European Union, of course, is in a difficult situation and would have to figure out its priorities very carefully and work on them very diligently and with great political wisdom. I suggest that these are the priorities mainly are three priorities, which, of course, provided that the whole constitution of European Commission and everything else happens within next weeks. Let's hope that the bodies of European Union will be fully established in a month or so. But then the three basic tasks are this. First, a fresh look and good definition of solidarity within European Union. Solidarity meaning various things, meaning cohesion, meaning migrations, and meaning other things which were part of the problem leading to the decision at the UK referendum for leaving European Union. Now, these problems exist elsewhere. They are not as dramatic. They are not leading to this sort of specific tragic decisions, but they are there, and solidarity has to be looked at anew. Secondly, there is a great need for European Union to figure out how to conduct its common foreign and security policy. And here is where we are approaching the question of the Middle East. Because European Union...
And do you know, can I ask you, do you know the Spanish foreign minister who's going to become the High Representative?
Yeah, well, you know, if one wants to use imagination in this context, one would remember that there were two great former Spanish foreign ministers who were very active in the Middle East, Javier Solana and Miguel Moratinos. So Borrell may be the third in that process. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is inevitably going to happen, but I wouldn't exclude the possibility that the European Union will overcome its traditional introverted approach to foreign and security policy. When I was president, I used to come to this part of the world, and very often I heard critique that countries in the Middle East see European Union as being too introverted, that there was a hope that European Union will become more active. Now, of course, in the new circumstances, there may be very good reasons for that, reasons which have to do with the new global situation and with the new situation within the European Union, and with the fact that one of the major priorities of European Union will be climate change and everything that goes with global warming. Now, that, of course, is not an internal problem of European Union. This is a global problem. So European Union will be, for reasons of its shock that it has endured and that it is experiencing right now, have to look at internal solidarity very carefully and try to find proper definitions. But we will have to look at the questions of global warming very carefully and figuring out who are the partners of European Union in that regard, China not excluded. And thirdly, it will have to look at the foreign policy and foreign and security policy quite seriously, because it will have to do with all other things, with global warming, clearly, with internal solidarity and the question of migrations. And let me conclude by referring to my friend Michel Duclos, with whom we were together in New York when we were both serving on the Security Council. And as I met him today, I thought, well, this is a wonderful new world for France if Brexit happens. If Brexit doesn't happen, then of course the Franco-British presence in Security Council of the United Nations will be an important asset of common foreign and security policy of the European Union. If it does happen, that leaves France as the only permanent member of European Union there in the Security Council, with important responsibilities and with an opportunity for leadership. So, Nik, you asked me to kind of list a few promising or potentially positive elements, and here is my list.
Thank you, Danilo. Anyone want to come in? I've got a microphone here. Anything we're not putting on the agenda yet, do put up your hand if you want to. Let me move on. We've got, until recently, a minister. You sat in European councils and sat in European meetings, Alistair, and also Michel as well, about the reality of how the European Union now handles issues and challenges like the Middle East. In other words, how do you create that solidarity, that legitimacy for the European Union at a time when the Hungarians, the Poles and others want to go in different directions?
Well, first of all, I think it can be fairly said that European Union policy towards the Middle East has been fragmented. It's not been necessarily coherent. And I think it has to consider what opportunities it has.
Is that a process issue or a political issue?
I don't think that's a process. I think that's more political. The processes are there and should be able to create one, but I think there's been difficulties. Let me take a couple. Of course, it can't decide where it is sometimes in relation to the United States. Middle East peace process, Hon Ashrawi, of course, understands this all too well. The United States has been the broker in relation to this. its current position is that it has lost any semblance of being an independent broker, but the European Union has not been able to step in and take it over quite yet, because the United States will remain integral, but to what extent?
Can I just check with you again, Alistair?
Yeah.
Has not been able to, or has not wanted to move forward?
Well, it's not chosen to do so because the United States does remain so important in relation to the process. We're all waiting for the plan to come forward, and then maybe something can be done after that. But that's one area where perhaps the EU might have been expected to do more, because the circumstances are clear that we will not get an answer in the near future based on what the United States is doing. But on JCPOA, for example, I think the European Union has been right to stick to an agreement that was hard won. I know it's not been popular everywhere throughout the Gulf, and that is another issue. But I think the United Kingdom and partners were right to stick to that and try and make the JCPOA work, because keeping Iran in the nuclear box has a benefit all on its own. Then if you look at Libya, Libya is a situation where you've got European powers taking different views. It's been clear that France and Italy have not been able to see eye to eye in relation to that. So you could look across the region and say, to a degree, the Middle East and the European Union has not been a coherent story. Now, all the processes should help to make it work. The process is very good. What I will regret and miss on behalf of the United Kingdom is we're not at the table. And it's not just not being at the table for the formal meetings, it's not being at the table for those discussions on the side, which everyone in this room knows are as essential as the ones that take place around the table. So we're going to have to look to replace the partnerships. Still on speed dial, I've got Paris and Berlin, and my counterparts there, and they would always be the first people I think ministers would want to speak to. But the relationship will be different, and we'll have to work very hard to make it a good one.
Michel, time is pressing, but you said something really quite sinister about the West's lack of influence now because of what's happened in Syria and the growing influence, presumably, of Russia and also China in this region in the Gulf. Quickly, please.
Well, it seems to me that the region is still looking at external powers, still looking at global powers. And in that category, you see the US more or less not leaving but reducing its commitment. You see Russia back, and you see China coming. It's very important that Europe should be there too. And then, when you talk about Europe and the Middle East, what's complicated is that on one side, the diplomatic game, war and peace, and so on, it's only about national state. Only France, UK, Germany can play. And for the time being, France, for reasons that everybody knows, but it won't last. It's just a transitional period. That's one level. But at the level of societies, at the level of the deep currents of life in those countries, only the European Union has the expertise, the finance, and the means to have an impact.
Do you think it'll have the political will, though?
That's a problem, that for the time being, there is a lack of coordination at the diplomatic level, and there is a lack of strategic mind at the level of the Commission and other EU institutions.
We're really short of time. I just want to get that. Can you make it 15 seconds, please?
15 seconds.
Microphone, please.
There is still an impression in the Middle East that there is lack of cohesiveness on the overall European policies vis-à-vis the Middle East. And you brought up the excellent point of the Libyan example. You can't even sort out the migration issues. And it's not just a vision, I think personally, and it's not country interests, but it's also the processes that are in there. I've been at the European Parliament, and I've seen how it works. So I just want to ask, what are you going to do, not only about the impression from the outside towards you, but also at the procedures that are very complex within the European Union?
Okay, just hold that question. One question here, please, or one comment, please. I'm stretching time, but I'm sure you can talk brilliantly fast and very concisely.
Thanks, Nick. Yep, this is Salman Sheikh. I've been working on Syria for a very long time. It's good to see friends up there. Look, as somebody who's worked on, particularly the northeast Syria, I'll talk about that a bit later, it's been quite extraordinary to watch European powers and capitals that we have been working with, knowing full well that President Trump was going to leave, but still powerless. Powerless. I've got London, Paris, and Berlin on speed dial too, and I spoke to them this morning. They have not a clue as to what they're going to do with this situation. And yet it shouldn't be a surprise. Why is it that Europe, for its own national and regional-wide security interests, could not have arranged itself better so that the vacuum is not filled by those that Europe doesn't feel need to re-establish themselves in that part of the world, particularly Daesh, but also the Assad regime?
I'd love to know who else has what on their speed dial. Yeah. Right. Let me pick up and ask John, Phil, and Danilo, if I may. Can you just pick up on those, particularly where you see this is going?
Very quickly, I realise the fact is, you know, Europe is 28, soon to be probably 27 countries. It is not a country. So we have to be careful how we just automatically compare it as if it was Russia, China, or the United States. And of course, you're right, when you look at the series of issues which Europe has obviously an interest in, the JCPOA, northern Syria, for example, you know, we have not been able to turn our stated policy objectives into action. And that needs reflection as to why that is. That's and just very quickly, I'm also going to say, just going back to what was being said earlier, there's a risk when we talk about the risk of breaking up the European Union and so on, that over many years I've watched this, and there's a tendency in the US and indeed in the UK to sort of overstate that and to underestimate the basic resilience of the European Union.
Right, I'm being given a stop signal, but Phil and Danilo, just coming quickly again.
I'll just make one point that I think encompasses all of it, which is to assert that I do not think Europe will benefit from the reduction in U.S. engagement in the Middle East. I think Michel or somebody referred to the U.S. getting out. That will not be an opportunity to Europe, for Europe, but I think that will undermine Europe's role even further. It wasn't that long ago that Europe's role was boosted as a partner of the United States, working very closely to put together the Iran nuclear deal, being part of the counter-ISIS coalition and what we used to call the London 11 process of close coordination on Syria, and I could go on. But now, as the U.S. Withdraws and does things its own way, think about where that leaves Europe. On Iran, despite the greatest of efforts, they weren't able to influence the United States. The peace plan has been prepared without them. And just in the last week, the withdrawal of Syria, the Europeans read about it in the newspapers like everybody else. So unfortunately, that leaves Europe on the side.
I strongly agree with that. I strongly agree.
Can I use, I'm being told to wind up, but Alistair, as you're here, is Brexit going to happen? I have to ask because no one knows, but is it possible that somehow, by amazing twists of fate, political reality, and other things which might happen in the coming days, somehow there will be an election, a referendum which turns against Brexit and means that Britain remains in the European Union?
No, I don't think so. I think the most likely outcome is the United Kingdom will leave the European Union. I'm not sure when, but I think it would be unwise to bet against that.
All right, thank you. And I have to say, there's real concern that the United Kingdom will not remain the United Kingdom as a result. But we can talk about that next year, Ragida, if we're invited. And maybe we'll look to the Middle East for some ideas of how to keep our kingdom together. Can I thank you all very much indeed? Danilo, would you like a quick word? But I'm being told...
Well, look, in the circumstances and having heard all the wise analytical thoughts with which I agree, I would reduce my remark to procedure. I think this is a moment when European Union will be in shock for quite a while, and that's also an opportunity to exercise leadership for the Commission and for the Council, not for the European Parliament, but for the Commission and the Council. And the real question, defined in procedural terms, is how are these bodies going to exercise this unique moment for leadership which never existed before and is not likely to exist in the future if it is not seized now?
Thank you all very much indeed, and thanks for the comments from the floor. Thank you.